Alright guys, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We have been hammering out projects on this thing and we are closing in on the home stretch. We really don't have much left to do. Now that being said, though we don't have a ton left to do, we still have stuff left to do and we need to get to it. Our list is shrinking. This is a fresh list. We started over because we crossed out most of the stuff on the other one and it always seems to grow back to a full list, but we've just been knocking them out one by one. And that's really how you have to tackle any project. If you start looking at the big picture, it's tough. When you get towards the end, you can, but if you do it in the early stages, it'll just overwhelm. So we're just tackling them one by one. So we've got a lot done. We're kind of bouncing around. We got the engine harness done to our bulkhead, from the bulkhead to the ECU, so that's pretty well sorted. Couple little things there. We got chassis wiring to do. We got plumbing, lines and fittings to do. We've got some mounting, some fab projects. We've got a whole smorgasbord of projects. So instead of talking about it, we're just gonna dive right in. So the first thing I wanna do is test fit our new alternator. So I got this DC power alternator. They're pretty big in the drift world. Everyone I seem to know that has a high level drift car that needs a lot of current, electric power steering, multiple fuel pumps, multiple fans, runs their alternators and seems to have great luck. So I got one for this, I got one for the Miata, and I got a spare. So we got a lot of alternators now. It's one thing, man, it's a simple part, really easy to change in a pinch, but it could take you out. So I'm excited to get this on. We're pretty limited on room on this car. We have a kind of weird alternator mounting location, so I want to get it test fitted on there. Oh, we won't even know because the header's not here. I still want to put it on and see how it fits. Might as well. All right, guys, before we get too deep into today's video, I wanted to talk to you about today's video sponsor, HelloFresh. So HelloFresh has been absolutely instrumental in Chrissy and I meeting our goals of eating healthier and eating at home more, cooking together more. I absolutely love it. The recipes are delicious. Every time we get the recipe pack, I'm so excited to see what we got that week, and I'm never disappointed. They're always so good. I'm excited for every single one of them. And they make it a piece of cake. Everything's pre-packaged, pre-portioned, pre-planned. You get this nice instruction sheet that's easy to follow. You don't have to look up recipes on your phone and write them down, and we don't have to go to the store. I mean, it's difficult for us to go to the store to get bare essentials, let alone go get fresh ingredients. So the fact that we can cut all of that out, just get a pre-packaged meal, boom, pull it out, cook it, instructions right there. It makes it feasible for us to do it, and it makes it to where we don't really have any excuse, because really we're done cooking in the time it would take us to get our food if we ordered it when we started cooking. So it's been awesome. I would highly recommend it. A lot of my friends have started trying it, and they've been really happy with it as well for the same reason. So if you're interested in trying it for yourself, go to HelloFresh.com and use code TaylorDrift16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. It's HelloFresh.com, code TaylorDrift16, 16 free meals, 3 surprise gifts. So definitely try it out. I'm telling you, you'll like it. So anyway, that being said, we need to get back to work, as you already know. So let's get to it. Probably get a slightly bigger belt. This should be good though. I think this has more clearance than the other one. Look at that, man. That is a snazzy unit. If anything, just for the billet front plate matches the rest of the billet, man. This build's so, it's just so, it's above my pay grade. It's so much fancy stuff. I'm not used to this. It's contrasted to me. I'm gonna get on a jibber jabber tangent. Josue is going to start working on finishing up this coolant line. We've got our one interior coolant line done, as you can see. So he's going to go ahead and make the second one. We really want both of these done before we start planning our wiring bulkhead for back here. So while he's working on that, I'm going to start working on our oil cooler. We need to get an oil cooler mounted before we can do the line from the pump, because it's got to go to the cooler, from the cooler to here and to there. And I think I got to make a couple modifications to our cooler actually. So we got some work to do. Let me show you what we got for an oil cooler. Where is my razor knife? Did you steal my razor knife from me? I'm gonna buy another razor knife so you can have your own dang razor knife. Stop stealing my razor knife. Probably the second time in 6 months.
it and kept it from yourself?
That you've used it. Alright. So we have Mishimoto bar and plate single pass oil cooler. Now the one difficulty is we need dash 12 fittings because we're going to be running all dash 12 line. So I need to cut these fittings off, weld these fittings on.
The shop's up. I want my
Alright, I got my fittings welded on. You can see the difference between cleaning with acetone. Look how normal the weld looks. And then when you don't clean with acetone. I forgot, didn't think about it until I started welding. Also, I didn't get down here enough, so some of the powder coating was getting in there. I tried to minimize how much I ground on it because I was worried of more stuff getting inside it. But they're both welded on. They both fit good, all is well. I'm a little nervous about metal still being in there. I flushed it out as best I could, but I don't know, I've got to mull that over. It's just, you know, it's a big risk to take. On the other end of it, it is before the oil filter, so I don't know. We're gonna decide on that later. I just wanted to at least get it done so we have it and it's ready. In the car, we got the coolant lines done, the interior coolant lines. So these came out really nice. You can see they route down there, tuck up against the side here, up behind the cage, boom, to the pass-through. So couldn't be happier with how those turned out. We've got them skinned in this Earl's heat sleeving. This stuff works really well. And this is actually up to code, up to passes tech at most events, as long as you have fire sleeve on interior cabin lines. So that's your option, or building a whole metal enclosure for it, which you can never really build it enough to cover them all the way anyway. So this is by far the better, easier way to do it. So those look really good. I'm really, really pleased with that. Those came out snazzy. So yeah, all we've got left on that front is these last two. So this one and this one. I don't think we have enough line left to do both of them. I'm gonna have to order some more line, but we should have enough to at least get maybe the long one done and then do the short one later, since that's going to be the easiest one. We also still have to pull the firewall out, do some more trimming to it before we finalize all this, and then seal it, panel bond it in. But yeah, another project bites the dust. Go cross it off the list, Josue. You earned this one. Cross it off the list. I think I might have already accidentally, like, finished crossing it.
Where is it? Right here?
It's firewall to firewall. That's it. That top one. Second. Yeah, that one.
Oh, I'm doing it again.
Yeah. Yeah. Woo!
What's next?
I don't know. All right, a little bit of a debacle, the oil cooler situation. So I thought about this some more, and after the fact that I had to carbide burr in it, that's what really got me, because that produces a lot of real small, fine particles, and I just don't feel there's any way I'm going to get this clean enough to at least, in my mind, be able to sleep at night and not worry that I'm going to send a bunch of metal through my fancy motor. So decided we're gonna try to go the original oil cooler I was gonna use. So I got this one because it was sized pretty much perfectly for where we were trying to put it, but then we ended up moving the turbo and so many things changed from then to now. So we can't fit it with the way things are now, but we can kind of kill two birds with one stone here. We wanna isolate the intercooler from the bash bar setup. This is how it was built on the other car. This was not my doing, you know. And it's something that's bugged me for a while, because if the bash bar gets hit, which is going to be the first thing to get hit, that's the point of a bash bar, and it gets tweaked, it's going to tweak everything, because the intercooler is fixed to it. So if it moves at all, now none of this is going to want to line up, and it's going to get tensioned. And I mean, if it gets hit hard enough, it'll probably tear up the intercooler pretty quickly, you know, with not that big of a hit. So we've been talking about ways to do it, and what we think we're going to do is cut both these bars out, build brackets to the frame rail. So basically mount the intercooler to the frame rail. That'll give us a big cushion zone around the intercooler to the bash bar. So the bash bar would have to get pretty cooked to start getting into the intercooler. Not only that, but then it would give us a little more crush zone to the frame rails as well. And that's, you know, kind of the idea behind the bash bar. So the other thing here, the two birds, the second bird is if we get rid of this bar, now even with our turbo mounting location change from the original plan, we can still fit the larger oil cooler. So I think that's what we're gonna do. It's gonna be a task. It's not gonna be that easy to get from there to there and make it really strong and stiff, but I think we can make it happen, and I think it's something that needs to happen, because if we put it off till later, and first event out, I bend the bash bar enough to get into the intercooler, we're gonna have a lot more stuff to fix. So I think we might as well take the time now. We're gonna come up with a plan and dive into it. So my fear with using that oil cooler wasn't the cooler itself. That's a really nice bar and plate cooler. I've used it on a ton of projects. They're super efficient. They work really well. My fear was the fact that I had to cut and grind on it and get all these metal shavings in it. There was no way I didn't get a bunch of metal shavings in it, and there's no way I can convince myself that I got them all out when I cleaned it. And that was really the deciding factor. I just didn't want to take that chance, you know. I didn't. So the idea here is to mount the intercooler, we need to know where it's going to go. Now, since the hot side's not on, the turbo isn't fully fixed. We can't say for sure this is where the turbo is. So we're trying to basically line up the intercooler piping. We know the intercooler piping's pretty rigid. It doesn't have a lot of flex. So if we get the intercooler in there supported, lined up with the intercooler piping, then it should be where it needs to be. Now, this was a little trickier than we thought, because the turbo can move around a little bit more than we expected. But after some fighting and some fussing, we finally figured it out and got it in place. All right, I think I got it. Took a little bit different approach this time. Only attached it at the top, didn't attach it at the bottom, and just watched till it lined up, so that way we can't tug the turbo around. I got the turbo tightened up in the place that it needed to be to line up with the batch bar on. I think we're good. I think we can start building to this. So now we gotta start making up how we wanna do this. I've got a couple ideas. We definitely are gonna need to hit both bolt holes to prevent rotation. If we just do one, then it can still rotate. We're gonna want this to be pretty boxed and sturdy. It's just gonna be tricky to go from two flat planes like this, right? It's not the easiest, but let's dig through our material over here, see what we've got to work with and what might work best. So this was one of those projects where I didn't really have a clear plan going into it. I had a rough idea of what I was trying to do, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to accomplish it. And sometimes when you get on projects like these, you gotta just start cutting some material, seeing what works, seeing what fits, seeing if your rough idea is gonna work. So we start cutting the pieces that are gonna go on the frame rails and the intercooler, the pieces that we're gonna use to tie the frame rails to the intercooler. So we go ahead and get those cut out of this really thick, really beefy rectangle tube, and then start mocking it up in place. Now our difficulty is this oil filter housing. It's just kind of in the way for going to the frame rail. So I decided, you know what, let me just clean them up, and then I'll start cutting them open and kind of massaging them to fit. So the idea is we're going to basically cut the top off where it goes onto the frame rail so you can get the bolts in there, and then you have a semi-box shape. Well, after trying it, it wasn't going to work like I wanted. It wasn't going to look great. That was my biggest thing here. There's a lot of ways to make it work, but making it work in a way that doesn't look like junk, that was really where the challenge came in. So I decided, let's change the plan up a little bit, and I went ahead and cut essentially the same pieces out of flat bars. So these are, again, pieces that are going to bolt to the intercooler, pieces that are going to bolt to the frame rail. Now, flat bar was actually my first choice. It was going to be hard with flat bar to get a lot of weld surface area. There wasn't going to be a way to land any sort of material on it that I was going to get a lot of weld that I was happy with without kind of just some crazy convoluted way. But after trying out the square tube, I knew that that wasn't it, and this was really probably going to be our best option. So we cut our pieces, we went ahead and marked our holes, so we matched the holes for the intercooler. Obviously, we already know where those two are going to go and when they're going to bolt in, and then we figured out kind of where we wanted to put the 2 bolts where it was going to bolt into the frame rail. Now, I would have done more bolts than this where it bolts into the frame rail, but we need a place to land the bar, and that's where all of this gets tricky. So we go ahead and bolt it onto the intercooler and see how it all fits, see if we got our holes right. We use some transfer punches, which are life-changing. If you've never used them, you thread them in to a given thread size, and then you essentially have a little punch right in the center of your hole. You tap whatever you're trying to mark with a hammer, and then boom, you got your holes. So we got that done. They fit good, but I needed to cut the bolt shorter, and for whatever reason, my bandsaw blade just went from okay to dull, super dull. So we had to go old school, cut these bolts with the grinder, get that bolted on, and now we just need to bolt our plate to the frame rail. So we got to pull the oil filter housing out of the way and put some riv nuts. So the intercooler, we had our bolt threaded holes, we had our threaded bosses to bolt into. Frame rails, we don't. We've got to put them. So we're putting some more riv nuts in this thing. This car is just made up of riv nuts. Even from the factory, there is a dozen riv nuts. So we got those in. We got the plates bolted on. Now we have point A and point B. So I cut some bars down. I got them to fit roughly where I wanted. We kind of trimmed them up for more so for aesthetics, the angles and such. Got them in place, made sure the intercooler was where we wanted, and went ahead and tacked all of this in the car. This is definitely a project where it is absolutely critical that we tack it in the car because we've got gaps and the things aren't landing perfectly flush just because of the angles that we're dealing with, and there would be no way to tack this out of the car and get it where it needs to be. So we get a few tacks in the car so everything's in place. Then we pull it out of the car and get our final tacks on. There was just some spots that you couldn't get to, and I wanted to let this hang and support the intercooler, but with 2-3 tacks, that probably wasn't going to be a great idea. So we went ahead and got a few more tacks on it, got it all tossed back in. It's always satisfying when you tack something and you weld something and you drill holes and all this stuff, and then the bolts go in by hand, no problem at all. It's always a good, very rewarding feeling. So with those back in, it's time to see if it worked. Say it.
Say it.
I had to say it. Aha, look at that. Still lined up. Alright, the intercooler is officially re-supported under its own weight. So pretty happy with how that turned out. It was definitely tricky to try to get everything lined up. So I'm not going to weld it out until we have the hot side back in. Ideally, if we come down to the wire, I might, but I'd like to have that all hooked up. The turbo fully fixed in place, know that all of this, basically know the turbo is where it needs to be and that everything still lines up before I weld it. Because if I weld it and we put the hot side on and the turbo is moved some and it doesn't line up, then it's going to be very difficult to fix then. So we got it tacked, still plenty strong enough. So it moves the whole car. So we are going to do some finish work, right? Like I'm going to trim this plate up. I just left it oversized until we figured out kind of where everything was going to land. We'll do some speed holes in these. These things are super thick. Just make it look nicer and more like a finished product. But for now, the intercooler is supported completely independent of the bash bar, which is awesome. So the next thing we need to do is cut apart the bash bar, and we're going to take the bar that was going from here to here on the bash bar, this guy, which was essentially what was tying our frame rails together, and weld it to these plates. So that way our frame rails will be tied together here, and again, the bash bar will become full crumple zone. You know, it won't really have any impact on any of this stuff unless you crush it all the way into it. So yeah, now I guess let's start, we'll start working on that, see what we can figure out. So there is no turning back now. We wanted to make sure that we are completely happy with our intercooler mounting setup before we cut these off, because there's not really going to be an easy way to come back from this. Once we do this, we're pretty committed. So we get them all cut off with the Sawzall, and now we've got a bare and empty bash bar, and we have a crossbar that we were going to reuse to tie our frame rails together. So we knew it was going to be too wide. We went ahead and marked it to cut the bulk of it off. Now we're going to try to work it and we're going to try to sneak up on it. It's easier to take more material off than it is to put material back on. So we cut the bulk of it off with the bandsaw, put it back in place, and as we expected, it's about an 1/8 inch too long overall. So now we can cut the tab off that was used to mount the intercooler prior, since we're not going to be using it anymore, and then take it over to the belt grinder, clean it, grind it down to the final shape, and get a good bit of the paint off of it just so it's easier for us to tack with the TIG. You really need clean metal to tack when you're TIG welding. So we get it all trimmed up, we get it to be a nice, snug press fit essentially. So we tap it into place a little bit with the hand hammer, and then with the actual hammer get it lined up exactly where we want it, to where it's clearing everything, and then tack it in place in the car. So the AC was blowing the argon away. If you ever welded, you know the shielding gas is important. If you have wind or something blowing it away, it doesn't work that well. So easy solution was have Josue stand in front of the AC to block it, and we got that thing tacked in. And now it's time to move on to mounting the oil cooler, or at least test fitting it. You know, this was the second bird of this plan of mounting the intercooler isolated, and the crossbar is going to be a perfect place to build our mounting tabs to. So we used some CAD, some cardboard aided design, cut out some rough cardboard templates, get an idea of what we need to make, trim it up, and try to figure out where we want to mount it, how far that needs to be, what the shape of the bracket needs to be, and so on. We transfer the rough idea over to some 1/8 inch thick flat bar, and then go ahead and cut our shapes out in the bandsaw. Now, when I know I'm going to round off the end of something, if I'm cutting it in the bandsaw, I'll usually try to roughly cut the round end in the bandsaw. It never comes out anywhere near perfect, but it just saves me taking off more material when I go to actually clean it up and finalize that shape in the belt grinder. So we get it in the belt grinder, we do just that, finalize rounding off of the end, get them roughly cleaned up, and then we need to switch to our coping setup. So we've got different roller dies for grinding and coping different things to different diameters. So we have the exact diameter of our pipe, so we use that to grind a notch into our mounting tab, so that way we can get a good weld surface area around the pipe, and we're not just welding to a really small spot. So with all that done, with them bolted back to the oil cooler, we can put everything back in, clamp it in place, and tack it all up. We got Ben blocking the AC this time. Always need an AC blocker. You don't want to turn it off. It's too hot for that. So we got them tacked, took the clamps off, tightened the bolts down, and what do you know? We've got a mounted oil cooler, a mounted intercooler. There's nothing left to it but to put the bash bar back on and see what it looks like now that the bash bar is just that, a bash bar, completely isolated from all this. And man, I gotta say, it looks pretty satisfying to see all that packaged in there. Now, we didn't get to enjoy the fruits of our labor for too long. We gotta take all of this back apart for two reasons. The first reason being, we need to pull the entire turbo cartridge and housing off, because we're going to make the oil return line. But with the fitting that we think we need to use to clear everything and get the routing we need, we can't put it in with the turbo on there. It's a hard 90, so it has to thread in at a 90-degree angle, and basically you can't do it with the turbo on. So really we need to get all this out of the way, to get the turbo out of the way, to thread the fitting in, to see if it's going to work. And that took a bit of pondering. We tried out a bunch of different fitting orientations and options, turbo in, turbo out, and we finally came up with a rough game plan. So I jumped onto task 2, which was cutting off this threaded boss from the intercooler. So this was used as a mounting point. We're not going to use it anymore with the way we changed everything up and the way we have it mounted now, and it is in direct conflict with fitting the oil cooler and getting the fittings in. So we get it cut off, we get it cleaned up, and that's that. All right, well, we've got our mount pretty much fully sorted out. I still need to add one tab off of here for the oil cooler, just so it's got at least one lower mount, but otherwise this is pretty well mocked up. I am so tempted to just go ahead and weld it out. It's killing me to leave it tacked. I just want to finish it and be done with it, call it good, but we're gonna wait, because like I said, we need to get the hot side on before we finalize it, because if we need to make any changes, it is going to be extremely difficult to do if we have this all welded up. Not to mention, since we have these gaps here, we're gonna have to kind of scab some metal in there, there's a big chance of it warping and moving. So we're gonna have to be careful when we weld this out. We're not through the finish line yet, but we've got the gist of it done, and I'm happy with it. It accomplishes all the goals. We've got frame rails tied together, oil cooler mount and intercooler mount, all independent of the bash bar. It's exactly what I wanted. Now, it's not the prettiest thing. You know, if I had some tube and a tubing bender, we could have made this look a little nicer. I am not a fan of it aesthetically, but we're gonna paint it to match the chassis. It should blend in all right, but that's really my biggest gripe. But it is pretty light. For what it is, it's really not as heavy as I feared it might be. So overall, happy with that. Another thing we got done was the oil drain line, the oil return line. It was tricky, man. the center cartridge on these turbos is so small, and having a V-band for the turbine housing and the compressor housing, there's not a lot of room between the two. So we had to use this ORB 90 and then another 90, bring the line down here. It goes to another Stubali dry brake and then back here into the oil pump. So since we have a dry sump, we can't really return to the pan, but we also have an entire scavenge stage for the oil drain. So just like the dry sump has scavenge stages here that are gonna suck the oil out of the pan and pump it back to the oil tank, this scavenge stage is going to suck the oil out of the turbo and return it to those and then back to the tank. So that is a huge benefit with how low we have the turbo mounted. You know, it would be very difficult with this drain because it's gotta go uphill. So you run into issues where the turbo wouldn't drain properly, it'd backfill and want to smoke out the seals. But since we're going to the scavenge stage, it's literally going to suck the oil out. It's going to basically create a vacuum and pull the oil through. So, and the reason we have the dry brake is we're going to do one on the feed as well. So that way we can pop those two dry brakes and pull the turbo off without making a mess. And, you know, if we had to do it in a hurry. So, pretty pumped on that. It's another big crucial line out of the way. All we have left on the big crucial lines is the feed out of the oil pump into the cooler, out of the cooler into here, and then into the engine. But I am waiting on a adapter fitting to go from 10, which is what we have in the block, to dash 12, so that we can run a dash 12 line all the way. For this pump and the volume it flows, we really need to run a 12 AN feed to minimize pressure drop. So waiting on that, we'll be able to knock that out. But yeah, so good progress. I'm glad it's kind of a spur of the moment project, but I'm glad we got it done and out of the way because I feel a lot better about it now. I just, having it mounted to the bash bar was just never good, you know, but it's one of those things in a time crunch, you got to pick and choose your priorities, right? So that being said, we're gonna switch gears a little bit. I've finally got some stuff I've been waiting on. So I wanna get this stuff kind of put on the shelf while we wait for a couple little things and get that stuff out and start diving into it. So what we got is all of our wiring stuff. So this took a little while. We got it really quick once we ordered it, but it took me a little while to order it because I wasn't sure how deep down the rabbit hole I wanted to go on this wiring project. You know, you started out with like doing it basic and then it's just kind of progressed. So I didn't really know until I started plotting out our chassis wiring, how deep down the rabbit hole I wanted to go, and decided to go about midway, right? So we're not going to a full auto sport harness. We're not doing the concentric twisting or anything like that, but we are gonna be using some better components and trying to do it as best we can while doing it on a decent time frame, right? So we're trying to straddle that line. So we ended up getting a bunch of mil-spec wire, a bunch of different colors. We've got these 10-pin auto sport connectors, and these are gonna be for our EGTs. So we have 4 connectors per header. So instead of having these have to go through a grommet or something, we're gonna cut them, bulkhead them, and then that way, when you need to pull the header off, we can just pop the connector, leave all the wiring, all the probes with the header, yank it off. Serviceability. So this is something I debated on. Auto sport connectors are definitely pricey. Good wiring stuff is pricey, man. But it's one of those things. It's worth it to take the time now and spend the money now and save ourselves some effort in the long run. So we got those, we've got heat shrink loom, we've got pins, we've got connectors, we've got pretty much everything we need, as far as I know, to build out our chassis harness, which I'm excited about because we're gonna be starting from scratch. So that's why I went ahead and got a decent bit of mil-spec wire. Now I didn't go crazy because this stuff is really expensive. So that was the debacle. But I ordered all this stuff from WireCare and got it super quick. Honestly, props to them. I had looked at them, I found out about them from Finnegan's channel. I popped in there when I was starting the build and kind of trying to plan stuff and order stuff, and I didn't really know what I needed or what I wanted for the wiring, so it was a bit overwhelming. But knowing what I needed, bouncing back from different websites, I've ordered a bunch of different odds and ends for this wiring, you know, over the last few weeks. And I gotta say, going back to their site, I was incredibly impressed with how well organized it is and how easy they make it to find stuff, because wiring can be confusing. So yeah, that being said, we've got everything we need. So now I need to plot this out. So I had written my pinout out, but I lost the OG copy that I copied. So I had my girlfriend redo it because she has way better handwriting than I do. And I copied it, so we have a few of these in case we screw it up. So since we're starting from scratch, we gotta replan this all out. I had it planned out with the existing wires, but since we're not gonna be using any of them, or at least not most of them, we now need to do it all over again. So that's what we're gonna do. Enough jibber jabber, let's get to planning and plotting. So before we can start planning our pin out, where we're gonna pin each wire into the PDM, which channels are gonna get what, we need to figure out every single thing we need, both low current outputs, high current outputs, inputs, and the keypad. So this is going to be all the stuff that's going to come in and out of the smart wire, and that's really going to be wired in our chassis harness in general. We need to know every single thing so we don't miss anything, because we've got to plan this out well ahead of time. We only have so many channels for the inputs and for the outputs, and we need to know what's going to go where and divvy it all out accordingly. All right, we got our input-output list done. Took the extra time, tried to make this as nice and easy to read as possible. I put the keypad in here too, which I can obviously just go look at it. But when I'm programming the smart wire, it'd be nice to just have this all in one place. It'll make it way easier to program. By contrast, to show you how far I've come in the prep work side of things, this is the one I did for the Miata. I don't even think this is the OG one. This is the OG one. Like, just pin, I think this is just pin numbers. Yeah, so that was one of the things here. So I just did, pin 1, pin 2, pin 3, pin 4. But the thing is, for example, you look here, on connector B, pin 1 is output number 4. Pin 3 is output number 1. So if you just have the pin number, you don't know what that relates to in the software as far as an output. So then you gotta go look and say, oh, okay, pin 8 is output 6. So anyway, I learned from my mistakes. This was very difficult to sort through after the fact, to add things or change things. We did it a whole lot nicer this time. So this is done. I've got an extra in here for an oil heater to heat the oil tank. I'm gonna run that. I don't know if I'll use it, and if not, I may use it for something else. But we're gonna run an extra up front. I may add an extra in the rear, just one extra, since we should have enough pins. But we know this is how we're gonna pin the connector. So we're good there, happy with that. Now, the next step, like I said, planning. We're gonna try to do most of this on the bench, since pretty much everything in here is going to a bulkhead. It's not like it's splitting off to a million different things in here. It's either going to the ECU, right here basically, or it's going to that bulkhead, or the bulkhead we're gonna place back here. So there's really only 3 links that we need to worry about. So we're gonna figure out how long we want these to be and split them up by rear, ECU, and front bulkhead. So on this list, we need to branch everything by essentially the 3 different links. We're gonna have a given length going from the PDM all the way to the front bulkhead, a given length from the PDM to the ECU, and then from the PDM to the rear. So we need to batch all of the different wires that are gonna go from each location to the other location up together, and then figure out which gauge wire we're gonna use for each one. That'll help us divvy out the colors later, because we only have so many colors, and we're gonna try to keep everything a different color, so we need to put some planning into that too. So now we gotta kind of clean up this mess that I've made with this pre-done harness. This is why you need to plan. So I've done this about 2 or 3 times now, just to be back to square one where I started. But we get it all set up, we get it all loomed together, and then we can start routing it where we want it to go, the whole bunch, pulling it out, measuring it, and writing down what each branch is going to need to be lengthwise, so we can build this all out of the car on the bench. All right, we've got our harnesses loomed back up to save, to live, to fight, to be built another day. We'll use these in the Miata when I put the smart wire I have for it in there. This would be a perfect harness to do the Miata, since it's a street car and has turn signals and stuff. So we got everything labeled out. So we've got front, ECU, and then rear, and we've got the length on each. So if it's coming, from connector A, it's 106, B, it's a little further, and then here it's the opposite. B is shorter, A is a little bit further, just by a few inches. So that way we know the length we need to cut them, and then we went ahead and divvied out our colors. So like this is rear, this is front. Anything that comes on at the same time as the other one, we're not controlling it individually. I use the same color wire just because it doesn't matter which one's which, and then that way we can kind of save the colors to use different colors for different things. Like fan 1 and fan 2 will always be on at the same time, so they're both brown. Fuel lift and fuel 1 always be on at the same time, violet. Over here, intercooler fan 1 and fan 2, orange. We don't even know for sure that we're gonna do that, but I wanna have that wiring there so we don't have to add it later on. I'm leaving us some extra. Same with the oil heater. I definitely don't intend to run that right now, but we'll have it or for something else up there later if we need it. But yeah, so there's a couple of oddballs like the brake input, the wipers, and then the power steering out. Those are all a little bit longer than all of these. But we have our measurements, we have our colors, we have our pinout. It's time to just do it. So unfortunately, we are out of time though. So as much as it's time we're ready to start building this harness, we're out of time to start doing it today. So that being said, pick this back up tomorrow, start diving headfirst into the wiring. Josue should be here and he can start working on, we can get the front end back on, start not having him knock out that oil feed line, set of lines, get that hammered out. Man, we could be a lot closer to this thing here in just a couple of days, this thing being done. So I'm pumped, man. I feel good. It's always nice to get a good game plan going, and it's the best way to do it. Planning is important, man. So anyway, I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. I'm sure I've done a lot of it this video, and I will let you guys go. So I hope to see you next time, hopefully. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye, guys.